So I'm delighted to introduce Manisha Desai, who's department head for sociology, Department of Sociology, and also specializes in Asian and Asian American studies at the University of Connecticut. Her areas of specialization are gender and globalization, transnational feminism, contemporary Indian society, and South Asian American issues. She is the author of Subaltern Movements in India, Gendered Geographies of Struggle, which is coming in 2017.
No, it's out.
It's out, okay, great. And, yay, even better.
Talk about money, it costs $150, so don't buy it, wait.
Okay, coming soon in paper. And co-editor of Gender, Family, and Law in a Globalizing Middle East and South Asia. Welcome, Manisha, and Sonia Alvarez will respond.
Well, we've had a lot to think about for the past day and a half, particularly today, and I think we're all tired. So I'm going to try and see if I can do the same that Alex and Jackie did, kind of, get us all aroused a little bit so that we can respond. And I want to actually start by thanking Darren yesterday for, in some ways, reminding us about the multiple temporalities and spatialities of wherever we are. And I think, for me, the first time I encountered that was in Australia a few years ago when, in some ways, it was symbolic, but it was very irritating to me because I'd heard it for the first time. So they had invited, actually, the chief of the Navy to come and speak. I'm not sure why, because maybe they had sponsored the particular conference that I was. It was the International Feminist Journal of Politics and their conference. And so she invoked, the people of the land, leaders past, present, and emerging. That was, the concept. And then everybody did that, and they had an indigenous person come and do that. She invoked, she left, and after that, everything went on just as usual. And to me, it struck me as, what are we doing? So now we've learned to recognize that we live and act on other lands, which have other histories and other people, but then we acknowledge that and move on. It doesn't seem to impact how we think, how we write, what we do. And I think Darren yesterday, in reminding us that, was reminding us, particularly for this project that Janet has put together, that what does that really mean, thinking about whose land we are on, who is able to speak here, who is not able to speak here, and how do we have that inform the way we think. And so I want to kind of, start with that, and having that in mind, kind of start with the question that Janet asked us to think about, which is assemblage thinking useful in terms of the global movements of, post-2010? And again, we all always speak from a particular place and time, and as an argumentative Indian, as Sen called us all, I have to start with some arguments, which is, why assemblage? Why now? Why 2010? Or why post-2010? Right? We've had, if we think about assemblages as ways in which a collective comes together for a particular purpose or not, whether it's ephemeral, whether it's, for in a particular space and time, for a particular project, right? Those kind of assemblages have been happening for a very long time, right? And so why does assemblage thinking come now? So what is, why do we need to use this particular theoretical hook right now? Does it enable us to see more than what other ways of seeing would do? And for me, that would be its purpose. If it allows us to see the current moment, whether we talk about social movements or we talk about crises or we talk about the social condition, if it allows us to do that, then perhaps it's something worth exploring. Right? And I'm not sure that I've come to a conclusion, but to me, I think part of the problematic of thinking about the post-2010 is to see a lot of these collective actions, whether they were political events, whether they were protests, ongoing or not, in a way that sort of puts them all together as a consequence of this current crisis of global capitalism. And I'm sure that's one thread that's going on there, but again, there are multiple temporalities and multiple spatialities that are being enacted and that are being made visible. And I think by sort of trying to put them all in this one way of thinking, I think we're doing a kind of disservice in terms of not only our ability to understand, right? And that's where I think also I want to kind of bring back one of the things that Darren said when he had his invocation and he was greeting us and he said he cut it short, but a couple of the things that he did mention, which I thought were very interesting. One was he said, well, we want to be good-minded and invite you all, but I think an important thing that he said was, what are your intentions in this territory? Why do you come here, right? And so I kind of want to ask us to think, what is our intention in asking about, does assemblage provide us a way to think about it, right? And if our intention is, okay, does this provide us a better way to think about what's going on? Does it help us to essentially think about a better social justice project, a way in which all of us can move there? So what is our intention? And I don't have an answer. I mean, this is a question that I want us to think, hopefully, today, this evening, but also when we come back tomorrow, that if you're not asking about our intentions, then I don't know that it actually behooves us to do one thing or another. So that's sort of, one question I have about assemblage thinking. Another, in terms of social movement, and both, Alex and Jackie and Janet, you mentioned that in their critique, that we're not necessarily replacing social movements by assemblage. I think, to me, social movements are problematic because, again, as thinking about, as someone who studied social movements and thinking about Tilly talks about it as a very particular modular response of European modernity, right? And those modular responses cannot just be reproduced everywhere else. So in my own work, I try not to talk about social movements, but much more as social struggles, or, and since I'm going to get to transnational feminism in a little bit, but also ways in which collective people across various spaces and times come together in solidarity. So there are solidarities, sometimes ephemeral, sometimes ongoing, sometimes for a sustained project, but these are solidarities. So instead of thinking about social movements, which does kind of reproduce a certain way of using certain categories from a particular time and place to another, which may or may not necessarily work, I think to think more broadly about these as social struggles around social justice, but there again, just using social justice, is it a placeholder like Alex's radical imagination, or what does social justice really mean? Or if we talk about radical democracy, what does radical democracy really mean? So it does need to have some kind of content, right? And so I think in terms of talking about content is where I'll make my shift to talking about transnational feminist movements. Because transnational feminist movement, the term itself, in some way, at least in the US Academy in particular, originates in the early to mid 1990s. And most people sort of talk about Indipal Grewal and Karen Kaplan's book, Scattered Hegemonies, as sort of one of the canonical texts of transnational feminism. And the other one is Jackie Alexander and Chandra Mohanty's text, right? And all these four scholars are in some ways, thought of as canonical transnational feminists. And what is it that they were doing, right? And in even the 30 minutes that I have, it's really difficult to talk about the really complex genealogies and geographies of what transnational feminism is, but I'm going to just sort of say very briefly what it was. And it's not, I think, unimportant that the two canonical texts and writers of transnational feminism are both Indian women working in the US Academy, right? But very often it's always talked about as women of color, right, responding to what was happening, right, in the US context in terms of feminism, both in the academy and also in the practice of feminism within the United States. But it's a larger context, right, and which is why two Indian women and their, collaborations, one with, Caribbean women, another with, a Euro-US woman, then gets reproduced as women of color critique of what was happening. Right? But the larger context for transnational feminism is both not only what was happening by women of color in the United States, and again, I think we've mentioned, and Glenn mentioned that yesterday, was that in the 60s and 70s, Black women in particular were talking about solidarities with third world women. In fact, they talked about themselves as third world women within the first, right? So there was already that kind of critique and context of who do we identify as, right? Who are our collaborators? And which was in one way a critique of what, white feminism, as we talk about today, but it was also because it was a larger project, and which is why when we talk about feminism as content, not just as women's rights or women's empowerment, and I have a couple of wonderful quotes from local leaders in India, which will kind of give you a sense of the ways in which you can even take content and reappropriate and refashion it. But before I get to that, I also want to talk about, so it wasn't just what was happening in the US in terms of black women and other women of color making, these transnational connections to women elsewhere. But there was also the context of the United Nations conferences that emerged. First in 1975 was the International Women's Year, as some of you may know, and then 1975 to 1985 was the International Women's Decade, and the United Nations became this very big site of essentially, through its preparatory meetings and elsewhere, kind of circulating a particular understanding of women's rights and women's empowerment throughout, and that was sort of one of the critique, right, initially, right? So the first conference that took place in Mexico City was very contentious, and part of the contention actually had to do with Israel and Palestine, because women from Israel and Palestine were saying, okay, if you're going to talk about rights, we also have to talk about rights and racism and land. And of course, a lot of the white feminists at the time thought that this was not feminist at all. Feminism was then restricted to just violence, sexual and reproductive rights. We didn't even talk about reproductive rights then. The language kind of emerged later, but it was primarily anti-abortion, violence against women, what was, narrowly defined. And so all of the concerns coming from women from the so-called third world at the time were very contentious debates, right? And over then in 1980, it was around sexuality. That conference happened in Copenhagen, and there it was, around heteronormativity versus sexuality. And then in 85, and I think that's where things begin to shift. It's the first time that the conference is in Nairobi. It's in Africa, and so you have who comes there is very different, right? So in Mexico and in Copenhagen, it was primarily North American and European women who were there. You move to Nairobi, and for the first time, you have a lot of African women and also Asian women who come, right? And so it kind of changes the tenor of what feminism is, what women's rights are. But at the same time, what's also happened around that time, I think because of the critique in the US, critique from the third world of the first world, you have a, emergence of what one of my colleagues, Jody Dean, has called solidarities of difference, that you begin to recognize that feminism and women's rights are not just about abortion rights, are not just about reproductive rights, are not just about violence against women. Of course, they're about all of those things too, but they're also about issues of race, of nationalism, of land, and various other things. And I think it was because women were encountering each other in all these places that they were able to recognize these solidarities of difference, and in some ways not necessarily always come together to work. There were always very contentious debates, but nonetheless, I think it expanded the understanding of what feminism could be and how feminism, was incorporated. But interestingly enough, fast forward 10 years, 1995 in Beijing, which was the big conference, and after that, the United Nations has not had a conference, and a lot of feminist activists actually do not want the United Nations to have another conference because the Beijing Declaration, as some of you may know, all of these conferences come up with a declaration, countries sign. That doesn't mean really anything because they could go back and do exactly what they wanted to do, but somehow it's a commitment. And people don't want that to be reopened because Beijing really did represent in some ways a diverse set of issues of what women from different parts of the world, were talking about. But again, transnational feminism at the UN site has been kind of critiqued as a way of, UN feminism, and that doesn't necessarily, reflect what's going on. But at the same time, I think even at the UN conferences, there are ways in which feminists have disrupted. And actually a very interesting book by Silvana Falcone called Power Interrupted really talks about the ways in which feminists of color, and she actually followed women from US, Canada, Mexico, and Peru, who went to the anti-racist conference in Durban in 2001. And her argument was, again, when you shift who goes where, the ways in which you're able to interrupt at certain times. And I just want to quote a little bit from her example of the ways in which women were able to bring this to the fore. And so let me see. Okay. And so I quote from her book, "One of the most galvanizing moments of the NGO Forum in Durban was during the closing ceremony on September 1, 2001, as then Cuban President Fidel Castro prepared to give the concluding address. We watched with anticipation as the motorcade entered the stadium. Castro emerged from the car with his fist in the air, and thousands of people went wild, chanting, cheering, clapping, and waving small Cuban flags. Clearly relishing the excitement, Castro faced the crowd, his stance defiant as always. Eventually, he made his way to the main stage, where 4 other men joined them. As the crowd started to quiet in anticipation, a woman yelled, "Where are the women?" Spontaneously, women after women stood and joined her. "Where are the women? Where are the women? Where are the women?" The chant traveled across the stadium, eventually reaching us. Moved by the power of this collective questioning, our voices mingled with those of the thousands of other women in protest. "Where are the women? Where are the women? Where are the women?" The chant lasted for what seemed like several minutes. All the while, the men on stage, especially Castro, looked confused. Castro eventually shrugged and pointed to the female English language translator on stage. That's where the woman was. Although it took several minutes for us to quiet down, the closing ceremony eventually began. But in those commanding minutes, women had challenged the notion that an all-male panel should or even could make the final remarks about racism at a global gathering. Women had disrupted, if only for a few minutes, a male-centric agenda against racism. Right? These women had demonstrated a politics of feminist anti-racism that I felt compelled to study. And then, she goes on, but in also talking about what came out of the Durban conference versus what came out of Beijing, and there again, it also has to do with the geopolitics of the United States and the ways in which it supported women going to the women's conferences, but not anyone going to the Durban conference. In fact, there was a lot of question about even whether the United States was going to go, and then I think Colin Powell did go, but the US didn't go, formally, and of course, a week after that was September 11th, so you can just imagine, what took place instead of that. But what's interesting is that at the anti-racist conference, anti-racist feminists were able to make a much more intersectional and contextual contribution than women had been able to at the Beijing conference, right? So intersectionality is another one of these buzzwords that people use all the time and critique all the time. But nonetheless, the ways in which you're able to sort of shift the focus of what gender means and where it means and what empower means were issues that women were able to much more effectively, in some ways, insert at the anti-racist conferences in the UN rather than the women's conferences. And I think that also tells us something in terms of when and where and how transnational feminists have been able to in some ways work. Another quote that I want to read, and again, these are two ways in which I want to then talk about the ways in which transnational feminism has been critiqued, both in the academy and outside, and how it might kind of get us back to thinking about assemblage thinking. And this is by an Indian feminist on the need of what she calls grounded translation. And that's very much related to Glenn's concept yesterday about grounded normativity in terms of, again, from when and where we speak and why it matters to us. And she talks about, the interpretive possibilities that become available even to disrupt hegemonic discourses, particularly of empowerment, because that's one of the other critique that, transnational feminists have been making about the ways in which women's rights, gender mainstreaming, empowerment, which has emerged from all these UN conferences, have made themselves, in some ways, particularly within the neoliberal context, kind of transformed a lot of radical feminist and women's struggles on the ground. And here's another sort of, interview that she did with a local women leader in Kerala, which is a state in India, which is known for a lot of its radical politics, both around feminism, but also around labor rights and various other rights. And so, this is already a state where even local politicians tend to be a little more radical than would be the case in other parts of India. And so she was talking to this local leader in local government and asking her about, what she thought about, the government sort of supporting all these empowerment projects. And I love this quote, which is, "One day a rocket and an airplane met in the skies high above. The plane was impressed by the rocket's fantastic speed and told her, 'How fast you fly, what is your secret?' The rocket threw her a glance that said, 'Don't you notice my tail is on fire? You too would fly like me if your tail were on fire.' And then she continued, 'Well, I'm flying very fast, but I have no clue where I'm going and whether I will come back home safely. You're flying slow, yes, but aren't you relieved that you know where you're going and will get home in time too?' Well, I think that empowerment is what the rocket is experiencing." Right? So even, the critique that these are, local bureaucrats and government officials who are just kind of following, a model of neoliberal governmentality in terms of women's rights, really doesn't capture what people on the ground will do, provided you have this kind of translation which is much more grounded, right? And so in some ways, as kind of transnational feminism from the US Academy, influenced by various, temporal and spatial critiques that have emerged in the US, elsewhere kind of morphed into what we today see almost as a buzzword, has evolved. What you kind of also see, and this is I kind of want to now refer to a piece that Janet just wrote that's kind of forthcoming in Feminist Theory about what she sees as a disconnect between transnational feminism in the academy and transnational feminism that operates, and she was particularly looking at the World March of Women in the context of the World Social Forum, right? And what she saw is that transnational feminism in the academy has become increasingly, complex, nuanced, theorizes intersectionality, post-coloniality, but that when she looked at, the transnational feminism, and again, I'm simplifying just because I want to make a point, which is that the World March of Women, even as they are informed, by, an anti-colonial project, informed by their own particular histories within Quebecois nationalism and socialism, that when you actually look at what they're doing in the World Social Forum versus transnational feminism in the academy, and in some ways that's kind of relevant to the point that Alex and Jackie were making in the earlier panel, Janet finds what she calls a misfit, and she finds that there's not much resonance between transnational feminism as theory in a particular site and transnational feminism. And both are activism. She doesn't necessarily separate them as theory and practice, but the theories of transnational feminism in two different sites in the academy versus at the World Social Forum, right? And she calls that a misfit. And to me, it's not necessarily a misfit because I don't know that why there needs necessarily to be resonance between these two different sites of theorizing, because they are different modalities and there are different purposes, and they sometimes may meet together. So for me, it's not so much a misfit as a lack of communication. That in some ways right now, I think transnational feminism, and this goes back to the conversation from the earlier panel, is that transnational feminism is theory as activism and activism as theory. And very often people in the field, particularly transnational feminists today who are writing, and again, it's very interesting that a lot of the critique of transnational feminism is again being articulated by other Indian women scholars, feminist scholars. And so there's this genealogy of Indian feminism that kind of weaves, and I've thought about it, but I'm not exactly sure where to go with that, but that's just something that I've observed, and I'd like you all to comment on if you have thoughts too. But that critique is that now transnational feminism, at least in the US context, really signifies everything and nothing. And most importantly, it signifies non-US, right? So that it's become another way to talk about what we used to call in the old days first world, third world, right? Or any of these. Exactly. So you no longer talk about, anything that's non-US is essentially transnational feminism, right? And so that's kind of become, a big critique of Whoa, 5 minutes. Okay, and I thought I wasn't even going to take my half an hour. All right, so that's kind of become a critique of transnational feminism within the US Academy. And so where do we go from there, right? And so, the most recent critiques that have come up, from Nagar and Swarth's book and others is a way to talk about, not necessarily to abandon it, but to kind of go back to the notion of transnational feminism and its relationship, its solidarities across borders, right? So if you think about, Grewal and Kaplan's notion of transnational feminism, essentially what they were trying to do in some ways was to bring the notion of colonialism, patriarchy to contemporary globalization as it crossed and led to what they called scattered hegemonies. That is, you see, same kinds of hegemonies, but they're not the same. They are, they in some ways combine in different ways, and that's probably, I think, the utility of assemblage is to think about how a lot of these different social forces come together in different time and context in particular places, and that might be a useful way to think about them. And so then you have Mohanty and Jackie Alexander talk about them as leading to solidarities across borders. So you're not sort of going back to the initial sort of early transnational feminism, which was sisterhood is global, and in some ways transnational was also defining against global feminism and against international feminism, and we can go into that later if you want to talk about it, but I don't have time. But so their point was, you know, there isn't a universal patriarchy. It was kind of Western patriarchy masquerading as a universal patriarchy against which we had to have this global sisterhood. And instead they were talking about solidarities across borders based on a common struggle, but not necessarily about the same things, right? And so that was sort of, you know, their way of saying we need to be, you know, again, located back into the kind of projects, radical projects we have. And so there's kind of a notion of going back and in some ways rethinking really the radical critique of transnational feminism and kind of reappropriating it as radical praxis, right? Both in terms of theory and practice of transnational feminism in different places as different women organize, and, you know, not necessarily women themselves, but as you have, particularly because that's part of the project, is if gender gets just reduced to women, and if you're talking about dismantling various kinds of scattered hegemonies and patriarchies, you can't really do that if you do not involve other people who are also part of that conversation, right? And so in some ways, I think transnational feminism both provides some ways for us to think about whether assemblage thinking can be useful, but I think neither transnational feminism, despite its kind of origin in post-colonial feminism, nor assemblage thinking provide us a way to, I think, deal with sort of two questions, which is, I think, what social movement theory in general has been doing, and I'm sort of talking about it more broadly. One is kind of the decolonial turn, and the other is the epistemic turn in social movements. That if we think about social movements both as sites of knowledge productions, as sites of coming up with different epistemologies that mark a rupture with contemporary epistemologies, and if we think about that as related to the decolonial project, then I don't think transnational feminism, despite its sort of ways of rethinking about gender and women's rights, has really deconstructed the notion of gender and the work that gender might actually do in different places. So while we can all think about the ways in which women's rights, you know, are the same everywhere, and are human rights, and human rights are women's rights, what does that mean for different groups of women in terms of how they define their rights in relationship to land and relationship to caste, particularly in the case of India, where Dalit feminists are now kind of, you know, rethinking a lot of what other Indian upper caste Brahminic feminists are doing. So I don't think either of those have kind of really looked at the way in which a certain kind of category of gender, which is based on a particular European binary, modern binary of male and female, gets reproduced and might actually allow us to rethink what rights might look like if we didn't necessarily go, you know, with those two categories. And maybe I'll kind of just stop there and take questions.
You know, one of my pet peeves is this whole idea. I just taught Sidney Tarrow's book not too long ago, and this idea of social movements having been born in 18th century Europe just drives me up a wall. And I don't think that we need to certainly adhere to such a notion of social movements. So one of the things we need to do is decenter the notion of social movements, which is what I think assemblage thinking and other kinds of thinking is going to help us do. Now on to transnational feminism in and of itself. A big question, you know, you said it originates in the early to mid-90s, and you mentioned scattered hegemonies and the Mohanty Alexander book. And I thought to myself, you know, well, first of all, from the vantage point of Latin America, as you know, transnational feminist organizing had started in 1981 and long before that. And, you know, transnational feminist organizing around the globe started with the first wave, so-called wave of feminisms. But as a conceptual category, I guess, it takes hold in the US Academy in the 1990s. I have friends in Brazil to this day who dislike the category because they say it sounds too corporate. You know, that we're not transnational, they are. it's a funny reaction. When I first heard it, I thought, but it's still, even from the vantage point of the States, or from the vantage point of North America, what is a transnational feminist? I've heard people refer to themselves as transnational feminists. Is it a person? Is it an analytic? Is it a framework? Is it a movement? Is it in the academy or versus on the ground? Is it activist knowledge producers in the World March of Women, or is it the International Women's Studies Association meetings, or et cetera? I think there's a lot of confusion about what that term means, whether it's an analytic, whether it's a form of activism, or whatever, that I think is worth considering further. I do agree with you that in the U.S. Academy, in any case, the term has come to mean thinking outside the U.S. box. So there's diversity, which is a euphemism for race and difference and discrimination, and there's transnationalism or internationalization of the women's studies curriculum, which became all the rage, and in which, by the way, South Asian women, because of their linguistic capacities, have been very central. And so there are many today more South Asian women, remarkably, than any other category of women of color in U.S. women's studies, which could be why the genealogy continues the way it does. It'd be interesting for you to address. To me, I think it's linguistic and the Queen's English, but. Well, I think it is a big part of it, but in any case, okay. So ways of thinking not outside the U.S., and that's what I think. So even if you don't think about it transnationally, like if I teach a class on women in Venezuela, it's considered a class on transnational feminism, which is preposterous, right? It's just a class about women in Venezuela. So it's a shorthand for all of these things. I also think that some people, this is different, some people tell the story of transnational feminism as if it were a story about UN conferences, and you and I know who those people are. And while it is true that there was a form of important forms of institutional activism, what people call institutional activism, that occurred through the UN process, there was so much that gets missed about actual transnational forms of feminist organizing if you focus just on the UN process. Because, for instance, I don't know, domestic workers have been organizing across borders, sex workers have been organizing across borders, trade union women have been organizing across borders, and feminism is infused in a lot of those strands of organizing, and they too hardly figure in either the popular imagination, activist imagination, when they think about transnational feminism, nor are they studied as such, right? So, and that's partly because those exchanges are often translocal exchanges. They're not like the Domestic Workers Association of Canada organizing together with the Domestic Workers Association of Egypt, but rather several groups that come together in these ways. I'm going to lose my time here. So the final thing I want to say, I'm sure that more will come to mind later, but this had to do something somewhat with what I said yesterday. Is I'm not sure what the transnational is in feminism today. I'm not sure where I find it. It's still in the another world translation that I mentioned yesterday. I mean, though the other world translation is itself in a somewhat fizzled out form, but that doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean it's not there. Doesn't mean it's dead. It's barely at the UN, right? Because most people have been completely disillusioned with what they got out of that participatory process. The few spaces that are transnationalized within networks, the few spaces in transnational networks that still exist are occupied by the elite in movements, and that's true of the World March, in my opinion. So you say transnational movements, and they've got, 138 countries are involved and whatnot, but there's only 11 women who travel, from one place to another. And so I wondered, I mean, I was thinking about this here. Wasn't thinking about it before I came. Might it be more appropriate to talk in some other way about globally minded translocal movements, or translocal movements who have a global political imaginary, to use Alex's term, or who develop together a global political imaginary or something? Because I think that the word transnational feminism never really fit many forms of actual activism. And anyway, so I'll stop there.